Hey guys, what's up? This video is going to be about the state of tanks right now on PTR 10.2. But before I start this video, I want to talk a little bit briefly about a lot of the tier list type content that I've been seeing. A tank tier list is often very basic in terms of how people rank tanks, which can be very easy processable information, but I think it can also be very misleading in terms of how good or bad a tank is. The game is very complicated, and lots of things can be good or roughly good at the same time. And lots of tanks can be very strong at something, but also very weak at something else. Which is why tier lists in general are often not great, is that what tank you play in High and Plus is vastly influenced by, what healer you play and what your DPS comp is. Which is why I think tier lists in general is content that I think you guys should take with a massive pinch of salt and not ignore it, because I think a lot of people bring up really good points, but I think you guys should have a more open mind in that this game is far more nuanced than that. That was just a brief talk about tier lists. Let's get right into the video. We're going to start off with Blood Decay. Blood Decay right now does the highest damage out of any tank in an M+ scenario. So what I mean by that is playing traditional M+ talents that you would play for High M+, you will do more output than any other tank. On top of that, Blood Decay has exceptionally strong cooldowns, it's very tanky, and it's nigh unkillable. Obviously, the weaknesses of the Blood Decay is always going to be the same thing. It will run into key levels where eventually it will just get flat out one shot. That is always the weakness of Blood Decay, where it runs into this trouble of you get killed before you can really top yourself from each basically big damage event. That's always a big of a struggle. I do feel like, though, based off my own high key testing that I've done so far, this isn't as much of an issue as it was before. There's two main reasons for this. One of them is augmentation, being as ridiculously strong as it is. And the other reason for this is the new tier set. So the new tier set has, with the most recent buff that happened a couple of weeks back, has incredibly high uptime. And this essentially reduces the damage you take by 10%, like while it's up, and it has incredibly high uptime. I think if we look at a Black Rock Cold 26 I did, it had a 76% uptime, but I have seen uptimes much higher than that. I've seen like north of 80+%. They have a very strong tier set that gives you a lot of damage, a lot of survivability as well, which is really kind of like what Blood Decay needs to go to higher levels, is that they just need that little bit extra oomph. So cutting into Blood Decay as well, I have also seen a lot of people sandbagging with Blood Decay. I'm going to go over this in a kind of guide video that I'm going to do about Blood Decay, about what talents you should take and why, rotation, etc. I'll cover that in a different video. But I just briefly wanted to say that a lot of people are stuck over this Umbilicus Eternus type playstyle, and I think it's really bad for multiple reasons. So for the most part, the Absorb from Umbilicus Eternus does absolutely nothing. The only time the Absorb from Umbilicus Eternus would ever be useful is if you're going a long period of time where you have to stay away from the mobs and you can't death strike, you can't stay in. Other than that scenario that I just mentioned, the Absorb is basically useless. And on top of that, the problem is that you have to commit so many talents to Umbilicus Eternus that you end up losing out on other things. That namely being 2 points in Heartbreaker, which I think is absolutely ridiculous for high keys in terms of the sheer amount of runic power that you can generate. And also things like Hemostasis, which just gives you insane single target damage. Both these talents are ridiculous. And also Bloodshot. I'm going to talk about Bloodshot in more detail. Just to go over it briefly, a lot of people don't think this talent is as good as it actually is because they don't understand it. So the way Bloodshot actually works is your Death Strike applies Blood Shield in the millisecond before it does the damage of Death Strike. So what that means is that even if you don't have a Blood Shield active, Death Strike will still get buffed by 25% from Bloodshot, which is ridiculous. This talent is like an obscene increase to your single target damage. Also, obviously, AoE damage. For example, you're pressing Dancing Room Weapon. Most of the time when you have Dancing Room Weapon up, because of the amount of parries you're doing, you're going to have a huge Blood Shield as well, because your Blood Shield's not going to get eaten as easily. So obviously that is, you know, affecting all of your rune weapon damage as well, which just enables, you know, all of your hard strikes to do ridiculous damage, and also all of your death strikes on top of that. Obviously the big thing with Blood DK right now is that it is going to get a legendary, Firalef I think it's called, from Firak, the last boss. However, we don't know what the legendary does. We don't really know how to get it other than it comes from the boss. It could be a quest line, something similar to last tier with the Evoker legendary. Not 100% sure about all of that yet. Obviously, it being a legendary, it's going to have higher eye level than anything else, which could potentially make it very, very strong for Blood DK and could, you know, set it apart from other tanks. That's something that we'll only know with more information. On top of that, Blood DK itself does have a kind of big weakness in that it doesn't actually bring any buff to the group. You know, outside of AMZ and outside of grips, for Blood DK to be brought to high Mythic Plus, it needs to do considerable amount more damage than other tanks, and it needs to just be incredibly tanky. Now, I do think both of these do apply to Blood DK right now. Now, there are other tanks that will be able to tank the same key levels, but those tanks, from my own testing, haven't got the same output. So that might not necessarily matter though, because for example, if we talk about, let's say, Brewmaster Monk briefly, I do think Brewmaster Monk has less output than Blood DK, but it does have higher single target. And then it also brings on top of that physical debuff, right? So yeah, I do think it's a very difficult thing for Blood DK. It would be very nice if they were to get some sort of, you know, actual kind of like group buff, raid buff type thing. I do think it has been a big weakness. You know, outside of grips and AMZ, they don't really bring anything to the group. Lots of people for a long time have been asking for a kind of leech effect, AoE leech type effect like that you had in Legion with the artifact weapon. I don't expect anything until the next expansion, but I do certainly think it is a problem for Blood DK, and it stops them from being as strong as they potentially could be. Next tank I want to go over is the Vengeance Demon Hunter. Vengeance Demon Hunter is a hard tank to really talk about right now because it has a lot of bugs. For example, as of this video, the 4 set where Sigil of Flame, each 40 Fury you spend reduces its cooldown by 1 second, still doesn't work. Basically what this means is that testing Vengeance Demon Hunter right now, you sort of don't get a good grasp of how strong it could potentially be, because the uptime of Sigil of Flame isn't as high as it should be, which kind of sandbags Vengeance Demon Hunter's potential a lot. I think they have decent AoE damage right now, and they have the most ridiculous utility in terms of they can pretty much solo CC so many different hard packs. There's a pack specific to Throne of the Tides, you know, there's a bunch of different casters, and you can essentially solo CC that group, which would be very difficult in a different style comp. And that's just the nature of having, you know, double grip, double silent sigil, double sigil of misery, and also an AoE stun. You're able to just CC mobs for an incredibly long time. I do think that's Vengeance Demon Hunter's biggest asset right now, because it definitely has a lot of weaknesses. I think you're going to struggle very hard on tyrannical bosses that hit hard. This is mainly because you don't have nearly as much soul generation in single target as you do in AoE. So what that means is that you lose a bunch of Painbringer value, which is very important to your survivability right now. Since you don't have the same fiery brand overlaps as you used to, your biggest asset right now is Illuminated Sigils, Parry Chance, and then Painbringer. Basically damage reduction you get from the amount of soul fragments you spend. And the thing is right now is that you're consuming in AoE ridiculous amount of soul fragments because of the new tier set, plus also Immo Aura as well, Fallout. You're able to just consume vast amounts of soul fragments, which means that you have much higher stacks of Painbringer than before. In single target, you don't have this nearly as much, and also your uptime of Sigil of Flame is going to be much reduced as well. So you're definitely going to struggle. I think on tyrannical bosses, you might have to cook a different build, perhaps go more a Soul Crush route. I'm not really sure what that would look like. I tried briefly going through it, but yeah, it definitely looks a bit tricky. Maybe there are some potential cooks that you could do in order to make a tankier kind of single target orientated build. That's the other thing as well, is that the single target damage of Vengeance is abysmally low. We're not talking just a little bit low against a lot of other tanks. You're doing 20k DPS less, which obviously Vengeance DH does give a ridiculous debuff with the magic debuff, but I do think losing 20k DPS over a lot of other tanks, some tanks are doing far more than that as well, or the gap is even bigger than 20k DPS. So I definitely think that is a big kind of L for Vengeance Demon Hunter. Regardless of that, I do think that Vengeance DH has vast amounts of potential. Its ability to CC packs is so incredibly ridiculous compared to other tanks. Like, I do think that the utility is just the biggest asset, and it could be a reason why you end up playing it despite all the negatives. But yeah, that's something that we'll have to see, I guess. Now we're going to talk about Guardian Druid. Guardian Druid is an interesting one. You were the king last patch, but I do think the loss of the old tier set has been very monumental nerf to Guardian Druid, both in terms of effective HP and also in terms of rage generation. And then on top of that, one of your best talents, Blood Frenzy, got hit really hard. So I do think these things combined together have made Guardian Druid much weaker for High Mythic Plus. Obviously Guardian Druid right now, if you talent into it, like if you go the Fury of Nature, Lune's Favored, Moonless Night, Galactic Guardian type build, does incredible single target, consistent single target, which is very good for raiding. However, for Mythic Plus, you're never going to play a build like this because, you know, you require things like Ursoc's Fury. Blood Frenzy is still going to be very useful. And obviously you want to go things like Raise as well. Going on from that, I do think that it's still very solid, very tanky, and it still brings arguably the best group buff in Mark of the Wild. Now, obviously, going back to what I said at the start of this video, this is still a potential playable tank based off the overall group comp, mostly to do with Mark of the Wild. But perhaps you play something like a Feral Druid or a Resto Druid in the next season, which would obviously devalue Guardian Druid completely and probably put this at the bottom of the pile of most people's tier lists. So I do think Guardian Druid is decent, but it's a very, in my books, a very B tank in terms of it's very average. It's kind of like a jack of all trades. I think in terms of dungeons, it doesn't really do anything spectacular, but doesn't do anything exceptional either. The tankiness loss is definitely felt kind of massively, I would say. Like, you're not able to get as many overlaps of Iron Foe easily while also spending lots of raises, which means that you lose value in terms of you don't get as much armor as you used to, you don't spend as much rage for something like After the Wildfire, and you also don't get as much absorbs from Ursoc's Fury Remembered as well. Obviously right now with this footage that I'm showing you is that the tier set is over buffed in that the two sets, for some reason, any rage you spend during Rage of the Sleeper instantly gives you the max absorb. So even with it overperforming in this video, it still doesn't look that insane, which just goes to show that when this bug gets fixed, I do think that Guardian Druid is going to be a very average tank. As I said before, it could still potentially be playable. However, I think if you run any other Mark of the Wild type class in your group comp, you'll probably never play this tank for high keys, but that still remains to be seen. Going on from that, we have the Brewmaster Monk, which is actually one of my favorite tanks to play right now on PTR. I sort of have a love-hate relationship with this tank. It's mainly because I absolutely hate playing this tank with Rushing Jadewind. It's something that I will talk about in a different video, but this tank, playing it with Rushing Jadewind, it's full-on cock and bull torture. It's horrible, but yeah, playing it with Special Delivery, I've been having a blast. This tank is so fun. I think this tank has a lot of potential in that it gives an insane buff with, you have Close to Heart, you have Generous Pour, and then on top of that, you have physical debuff as well. Like, this tank is insane in terms of what it brings to the group. I think they are very tanky right now. It is kind of weird though, because out of all the tanks that I've tested, I do feel the difference between having augmentation in the group and not having augmentation in the group the most with Brewmaster. I think it mostly comes down to the fact that Brewmaster, you have these very large gaps in not having something big up, i.e., you don't have a Celestial Brew up, or you don't have a defensive up, and you need something to carry you over until you get to the next Celestial Brew. And oftentimes, without augmentation, it feels like you can't really do that, and you need to just immediately kite. However, with augmentation, you get this kind of like feeling that you can just power through until you get to your next Celestial Brew, which just makes all the world difference in terms of how you approach packs as a Brewmaster with augmentation, and just makes you feel a lot more tanky in terms of that you can actually stay in packs, and you don't need to kite as much, that things aren't as scary. So yeah, I do think you definitely want to play with augmentation when you play this tank. I think augmentation for every tank is absolutely absurd in terms of what it brings. In general, I feel like augmentation is like 3 to 4 key levels difference. The spec is just absolutely broken in terms of how it helps tanks. But yeah, going on from that, if we're specifically talking about Brewmaster, if we look at specific dungeons as well, I think this tank is absolutely ridiculous in something like Blackrock Hold. In Blackrock Hold, a lot of the damage is just pure physical damage, which is very good for Monk. Monk kind of struggles with high magic damage. I think you're probably going to struggle with, say, something like the second boss of Darkheart Thicket quite a lot on high keys in comparison to a few other tanks. They'll be able to deal with that boss a little bit better. But yeah, something like Blackrock Hold, Monk feels exceptionally strong against, has really good stops for the scouts, for the archers, can do very large pulls without really getting, one shot very easily. On top of that, is insane versus third boss and the gauntlet towards last boss as well. I think you're a very strong tank against, just purely because it's all physical damage and you can deal with it, rather well. You also have a very good kit for kiting as well. I'll probably go over this in a different video, talking mostly about ranking tanks based off the dungeon, but I think Brewmaster right now is very, very strong. There was a little bit of a few people saying that this tank was not very good after the recent change. So basically Brewmaster's 2-set recently got fixed, where the 2-sets can no longer crit. It could crit before. Basically the heal, Charred Dreams, was overhealing massively, but it was just keeping you topped basically permanently all the time. So you were literally immortal as a Brewmaster outside of getting, absolutely one shot. Yeah, they fixed that. And obviously that's been a, very big nerf to Brewmaster. But regardless of that, I still think your tier set is very strong. And I do think Monk looks to be one of the strongest tanks for high end plus. A few people have kind of like marked it down, but I personally think that's a mistake. I think Brewmaster has a lot of potential. I do think it will struggle in some dungeons, like Darkheart Thicket, as we talked about, although that dungeon looks hard for every tank, to be honest with you. I also think Brewmaster Monk gives a very unique buff in that Windwalker doesn't look great right now, and Mistweaver has been a big hit or miss in M+ for a very long time. So Brewmaster gives a very unique buff in a way that no other tank obviously brings, and not many specs bring. And lots of times those other specs, as we just talked about, are not really viable. Yeah, I do think this tank has a lot of potential to be very good. We'll have to see how it goes. Okay, now we get on to my favorite tank. Or well, what's been my favorite tank for a very long time, which is the Prop Paladin. Okay, so before we talk too much about Prop Paladin, it has unfortunately had a very annoying bug recently, which has made it hard to test, where the tier sets, basically every stack of sanctification you get gets instantly removed on any cast of consecration. So what that means is, for you to get your empowered consecration, you have to not replace your first consecration at all, and basically power through all of your judgments until you get to the empowered consecration. So what that means is, if there's any movement where you have to replace your consecration at all, your tier set completely goes out the window and it's almost useless. Obviously, I hope Blizzard fixes this soon, because it's a ridiculously annoying bug. Your tier set is completely useless. If we assume that they're going to fix this, then I think your tier set is actually pretty decent as Prot Paladin. It is a little bit annoying to use because regardless of if the fix comes through or not, you will struggle with movement. If you have an empowered consecration coming and then you have to move a lot and you move out of your empowered consecration, then you're basically devaluing your tier set and you're not getting as much out of it. However, if you do play good around this tier set, there is a massive reward in that your damage output is very high. Prot Paladin has the second highest damage output out of all the tanks in high keys right now. Its single target is a bit meh, but the kind of damage you'll be able to do overall is basically only second to Blood Decay, I would say. So the damage is very good. The utility is still ridiculous. You know, you bring Devo Aura, Ret Aura if you need. You know, Bop, Sack, Spell Warding, still a ridiculous tank. There's also the ability to deal with very hard things that will likely be the gatekeeper of a key. So for example, there's 3 mobs in Everbloom before the 3rd boss, and they require a ridiculous amount of kicks. And these mobs are not CCable in any way. They just require raw kicks. You can't stun them. The Silent Sigil would interrupt them on the cast from a DH, but it wouldn't actually silence the mobs. So having something like a Prot Paladin would basically enable you to deal with this group much easier, in that you could have the Prot Paladin solo a mob, so that the potential amount of damage that's going out on the group is far lower, making it much more manageable. So that's like a potential big buff to Prot Paladin, in that it's able to deal with a pack like that. The other thing as well though is that if Holy Paladin is good, as it was last tier, this tank does get devalued in many ways. Obviously you could still run it, you know, and you could have Ret Aura and Devo Aura, which we had in season 1 of Dragonflight. However, I do think lots of times, since you share so much utility, it is better to potentially play something else, unless Prot Paladin is just vastly stronger than other tanks. I do think though, Prot Paladin does struggle with one thing, which is that the higher key you go, the less damage output you're going to be able to do, because of the fact that you're going to have to WOG yourself far more, which basically means you're losing potential SOTRs. And since WOG is a global as well, it's on GCD, you are losing potential other globals as well. It's been a big problem for a long time. I've asked them to fix this numerous times where, you know, please just take WOG off GCD. But yeah, it is what it is. That's always been like a little bit of an annoying thing with Prot Paladin. And then the other thing as well is that you tend to have to overuse the higher key you get. So for example, you get to key levels where just having Sentinel up is not really enough, and you have to rotate things inside Sentinel. That was always the case, even with season 1 Dragonflight, you know, it's playable around that. And then, you know, when you run out of anything, you need to just kite as a Prot Paladin. It is a little bit different to some other tanks that could potentially face tank for longer. Regardless of that, I think they are in a very strong state. Immunities seem very strong in a lot of the dungeons, namely Throne of the Tides. The Snapdragon debuff, the bleed from the mobs, isn't dwarfable, and it's not dispellable by Evoker. However, you can bubble it, which I think this bleed will probably get nerfed, hopefully. But right now for hierarchies, it's basically one-shotting tanks. So you really need something like, you know, bubble, you know, an immunity to deal with it effectively, which obviously Prot Paladin has. Okay, now we get on to the final tank, which is the Prot Warrior. Now this has been a very interesting tank, and I've heard a lot of hyperbole with this tank in terms of people saying, oh my god, it's broken, it's OP. I don't think any statement like that is true. Regardless though, I think this tank does look very strong. It's incredibly tanky, has ridiculous amount of CDs. The damage though is a little bit, yeah. I do think though, obviously in high reflect dungeons such as Waycrest Manor, obviously your damage is going to be, you know, ridiculous the higher and higher key you go, and you're going to be able to do, you know, insane boss damage. One of the things that mattered a lot in BFA in Waycrest Manor was being able to push the Witch's boss before it did the big AoE, which basically killed your whole group on a high key. And having Reflect for something like that just enables you to do that very easily, or well, more so than what other tanks could do. So yeah, that is always a big thing to think about when it comes to Prot Warrior. I do think though that the damage outside of that is very average. In a way, it's kind of good that it's tuned that way, just because of how, you know, Reflect works. And I do think that this is going to be a very solid tank for dungeons this tier. Just very tanky. The tier set basically gives you permanent 14% DR and then 16% DR if you remove Thunderous Roar as well. On top of that, you're getting to haste levels where you don't need to run heavy repercussions anymore and you don't need to run bolster. So roughly from my testing, you need north of 35% haste unbuffed to basically be able to do that, where you can have basically 100% uptime of shield block with Into the Fray without any of these talents. Obviously you still need enduring defenses to be able to do all of this, but yeah, you're getting to basically haste levels where you don't require these other talents as much, which enables you to go into other talents. You know, for example, you can pick up Blood Surge really easily now, as well as having spell block, which was actually kind of a little bit of a trouble before. So yeah, I do think that's like really nice for Prot Warrior, is that you get to this level of haste more easily as you get more gear, where you're able to get these things that you want. Because I do think after testing, the damage difference, especially in AoE, of having Into the Fray and not having Into the Fray is quite vast. And I do think you need to have spec a little bit more for more damage. Overall, I think Prot Warrior is very solid. Going to be one of the stronger tanks, I think. And I do think it's a very good for anyone that wants to kind of have multiple tanks for a tier, for pushing or whatever. I do think Prot Warrior is a good shout as a second tank to have, basically in your back pocket, you know, geared for like certain dungeons, specific dungeons. It has always kind of been like that. I mean, it was like that last tier with Neltharion's Lair, and it will almost certainly be like that again this tier coming. The other kind of like more recent change that they did as well was they made the difference between being in defensive stance and not being in defensive stance as vast, which certainly helps you a lot in terms of damage inside high keys, especially since for pretty much most scenarios you always want to be in defensive stance in high keys. So yeah, I do think that's very nice for them. So yeah, this was basically my kind of state of tanks right now on PTR. I am going to go do another video and go more in depth into every single tank and probably do like a guide style video, since I was very brief in my commentary. Regardless, I think right now, if you wanted me to kind of like briefly talk about how strong certain tanks are, I do think that the plate tanks look to be the strongest. So Blood DK, Prot Paladin, Prot Warrior. I do think Brewmaster Monk looks very spicy as well. Absolutely love it. And I think the weaker tanks right now is Guardian Druid, Vengeance. But Vengeance, as we talked about, is a very tricky tank to kind of talk about, since a lot of stuff is bugged, not working as intended. It's probably going to get buffed. It's getting buffed every single week, pretty much, Vengeance. So it is a tank to look out for. It was the same with last tier, where it launched in 10.1 and then immediately got buffed. So yeah, Vengeance is a very weird tank in that you never know what to expect with that tank. It's very hit or miss. So I do think it's a tank to watch out for. I will say with Guardian Druid, it has potential in that it, you know, has a very good buff. But yeah, I do think the tank itself does look very average. That's not to say that you wouldn't be able to push high keys on it. I think you certainly will be able to. But I think the rank 1 squads, the people that will go for the highest keys, will probably not want to play this tank versus a few of the other options. But that all depends upon if people end up playing Resto Druid, if people end up playing Feral Druid. Have to see, because obviously that is a very inadvertent buff to Guardian Druid. If people don't want to play these specs, you know, that leaves it open to be played, which goes back to how complicated it is to rank these tanks. That was the video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and yeah, I will catch you later.